Jason Arday, From Academic Scrutiny to a Carnival of Cruelty. Over the last few days, I've changed my mind about what the most important question is in the Jason Arday story. At first, I thought I was trying to work out whether he was good enough for Cambridge. I looked at his thesis, his academic career, and listened to academics who questioned whether his work justified such a prestigious appointment. Those conversations were useful, but eventually I realized I was drifting into trying to judge an appointment process I was not a part of. Those academics weren't employing Jason Arday. They weren't sitting on the Cambridge appointment panel. They didn't know who else applied, how those people interviewed, what Cambridge was looking for, or what Arday said when he walked into that room. And neither do I. What I do know is that Jason Arday had an established academic career. He earned a doctorate, published academic work, held posts at several universities, and became a professor before Cambridge appointed him. Those achievements happened, and I don't think they should suddenly be treated as imaginary because questions were later raised about parts of his academic work. You sometimes hear his story described as though Cambridge found somebody with no relevant qualifications or experience and handed him a professorship because he was black. That simply isn't an accurate description of what happened. Could somebody else have had a better thesis, more publications, and more experience? Almost certainly. But that doesn't mean that person was entitled to the job, because that isn't how recruitment works. We all know people can get jobs over candidates with stronger qualifications because they interview better. Maybe they communicate more clearly, connect with the panel, or simply come across as somebody people want to work with. Sometimes people just like your vibe. Universities make those judgments. One candidate might have the strongest publication record, another might be the best teacher, another might interview brilliantly, and another might simply make the university look good. I don't think there's anything automatically wrong with that. Universities care about reputation, attracting students, funding, partnerships, and how they present themselves to the world. So if Cambridge believed appointing Jason Arday also said something positive about black representation, that alone doesn't make the appointment illegitimate. Cambridge was appointing somebody to a job. It wasn't awarding a prize for the best PhD thesis. None of that means his academic work should be beyond scrutiny. And this is where we get to the thesis. Jason Arday's doctorate runs to more than 400 pages and examines peer mentoring and reflective practice among student teachers. The empirical research involved 4 student teachers, and Arday himself acknowledged limitations in the study. The thesis also contains its own methodology, participant material, analysis, findings, and discussion. Later analysis reportedly identified around 188 sentences that were identical or highly similar to material in an earlier doctoral thesis. Using the rough count we've been working with of around 4,100 sentence-like units in the main thesis, 188 represents approximately 4.6%, or around 1 sentence for every 22. That's significant enough to justify serious questions about attribution. But it does not mean 4.6% of the doctorate was formally found to have been plagiarized. And it certainly doesn't mean Jason Arday simply copied an entire PhD. There's a huge difference between saying there's significant similarities here that deserve scrutiny and saying Jason Arday copied his doctorate. Liverpool John Moores University had already investigated plagiarism allegations concerning the doctorate, and the PhD continued to stand. stand. People were entitled to disagree with that decision. They could look at the 188 sentences and believe the university had been too lenient, but they weren't waiting for an academic judgment on the thesis. They were challenging one that had already been made. That changes how I look at what followed. Nathan Coffness didn't originate the concerns about Jason Arday's academic work either. Questions had already been raised before he became heavily involved in publicizing the issue, but Coffness did help push the conversation into a much wider ideological argument, and I think it's fair to ask about the context in which he did that. That doesn't mean dismissing his evidence. If sentences were identical, they remain identical regardless of who discovers them. But Coffness already had strong views about race, merit, and black representation in elite institutions. So it's reasonable to ask whether Jason Arday was simply an academic whose work he happened to examine, or whether Arday also fitted into a wider argument he was already making. Somewhere around there, I think the story changed. A legitimate argument about attribution becomes something much bigger. Jason Arday became evidence against DEI, he became evidence against black academics, he became evidence that universities had supposedly abandoned standards. One academic was suddenly carrying a much bigger argument on his shoulders than whether 188 sentences had been properly attributed. That is where I think academic scrutiny started becoming something else, because his documented achievements had not disappeared. His doctorate still stood. His academic appointments still happened. He had already become a professor before Cambridge, and Cambridge still interviewed him, assessed him, and chose to appoint him. And Cambridge's role matters. Cambridge assessed him, Cambridge selected him, appointed him, and publicly celebrated the appointment. The same goes for the universities that examined, employed, and promoted him before that. That doesn't absolve an academic of responsibility of their own work, but academia is a system of supervision, examination, appointments, and promotion. This is also why I've moved away from trying to decide whether another professor had done more academic heavy lifting than Jason Arday. Maybe somebody else had a stronger thesis or larger body of work, but they weren't the employer. Cambridge was. We can criticize Cambridge's judgment, but finding somebody with a better CV does not prove Jason Arday had no legitimate claim to the job. This is how recruitment works anywhere else, and I see no reason to pretend academia is completely different. Then Jason Arday died. There's a difference between scrutinizing somebody's academic work and hounding the person behind it. Scrutiny asks questions and examines evidence. Hounding begins when people have already decided what somebody is and simply keep looking for more confirmation. By the end, Jason Arday wasn't just being discussed as an academic whose work contained serious questions. He was being turned into a fraud, a DEI hire, and proof that black academics had been promoted beyond their abilities. But scrutiny should still be about establishing truth. It should not require us to erase documented achievements. And it shouldn't turn one person into evidence for a political argument about an entire group. Jason Arday earned a doctorate. That doctorate still stood. He progressed through academia, became a professor, and was appointed by Cambridge. Those facts don't answer every question about his scholarship, but questions about his scholarship don't erase those facts either. And perhaps that is where this whole episode crossed a line for me. Not because Jason Arday was beyond criticism, not because the concerns were invented, and not because every institution involved necessarily got everything right, but because there was a point where legitimate academic scrutiny stops being about academic standards and starts becoming something more personal, ideological, and relentless. And perhaps the question we should be asking now isn't whether Jason Arday should have faced scrutiny. Of course he should have. The question is whether legitimate scrutiny eventually became something else entirely.